life and grace that comes from deep within. Within my faith, within his love, once again. And I will sing a new song. And I will play before the Lord. And I will live my life for God. And I will be a new creation. And I will sing a new song. And I will play before the Lord. And I will live my life for God. And I will be a new creation. And I will be a new creation.
One way of thinking about some of the social dimensions or systemic, you hear a lot, obvious, again, in our current social context and political context, economic context, all of the different systemic abuses within the human family, the systemic racism we're absolutely more conscious of than ever now, the systemic inequalities that exist, and then the conflicts that come because of that. I think it is maybe helpful to, so much of those things are categorized in very, in some sense, secular terms. And I think there is an opportunity maybe for us as beloved children of God, part of the family of God, to see what we can do to think about some of these things in a different light, because boy, it's just exhausting the way, no matter what the issue is that comes up these days in our lives, boy, that 51-49, 50.5, 49.5 split just happens again and again and again. It's unbelievable the way these kind of intractable kind of dualism that kicks in, that immediately sets whole groups of people against each other, and then the feeling of my side, or if I belong to this side or that side of this question or that question, I can't give in one bit. I can't acknowledge any nuance in my own positions on different things. It's really unbelievably effective, this strategy that the enemy has, I think, with us right now in dividing us against one another, and in varying ways dehumanizing those who disagree on the other side of whatever the issue is. But a little bit of I thought maybe just a quick little thing on some of the origins of the way, even within the church, that we have thought the development of some of the thought about social sin or systemic injustices or social justice. As you might know, I haven't really read much about this person, but even the term social justice was apparently coined by a Jesuit, believe it or not, named Luigi Tapparelli. He was born in 1793 and lived up until 1862. And if you're familiar with that periodical that comes out, La Civiltà Cattolica, he was one of the co-founders of that a kind of a newspaper that was generated and still continues to this day from the Holy See to stay up to date on current issues and topics and economic and political realities, but attempt to do that through the lens of a Catholic vision of who the human person is and what society ought to look like, and where there are problems, to try to shed light from a different perspective, hopefully from what our typical political differences are. And I think it's kind of interesting to note, for most of the history of the life of the church, matters of questions of morality and moral theology mostly had to do with the individual person, and mostly had to do with through the lens of confession. A lot of moral theology developed because you had to train priests about how to hear confessions and how to make distinctions about what was a moral thing to do or not a moral thing to do, and so that they could get right with God again in the context of the confessional. Lots of the moral tradition comes out of that. But there's kind of a big development in some ways that came in the 19th century because the world was very different very quickly. With the Industrial Revolution, massive movement into cities, building huge factories that were employing huge numbers of people. That was where the economy moved. There were people moving into those jobs that also became very dehumanizing jobs within these factories without, attention paid to the dignity of individual persons working in these factories. At the same time, those people who were controlling the resources and were able to gather the capital to build these kind of factories, of course, they were getting richer and richer and richer. And so huge gaps between the haves and the have-nots really started to intensify in the 19th century. And for a variety of reasons, it became possible to generate massive amounts of wealth if you were in control of those resources, of that capital. And you could barely make a living if you were one of the cogs in the machine in those factories. But there was also a dehumanization happening at that level on a massive scale. And it's no coincidence that then the philosophy of, among others, Karl Marx, comes in to say, look, we are all of a sudden there's always been injustice in the world and in society, but it is so intensive right now. We need a revolution to topple all of these kinds of unjust structures and to make it so that people can be, so that we can have equity among all people. And the way that we're going to accomplish that is ultimately the state needs to take over everything and make sure that things are equitable from here on. It's a pretty loose description, I think, of what the critique is and what the solution was in a kind of a socialist effort. Well, then from the church's side of things, always slow to respond to issues like this, but catching up, the more that some of the socialist philosophy starts to take over and a desire to have the state control everything and make sure there's fairness and to manage that fairness within society. Of course, the church gets, as an institution that is going to get wiped out because of that same kind of ideology, but not just because of that. There's a critique that starts to come back from the church, and especially through people like this Luigi Tapparelli, saying, look, there's a good intention perhaps in recognizing we've got massive problems and inequalities here, and there are structures that are sinful, that are actually leading the very rich into a different kind of dehumanization and the very poor into a different sort of dehumanization. This is not good for anybody. What's being lost here is the sense of who the human person is at the core, right? Everything is becoming about material resources and power and control and manipulations and so on. And some are doing the oppressing and others are being oppressed. But what's lacking in the midst of all of it is, who is the human person? And it comes back to that sense that the human person has infinite dignity, being made in the image of God, and the human person is necessarily relational, that we are all have this common bond of humanity among ourselves. If we are gradually setting up an economy or a political structure that ignores the sanctity of who the human person is and the equal dignity that every human person has, the way that every human person needs to be ideally in communion with each other, and instead it just becomes a matter of transactions and ability to manipulate resources and so on. There's a dehumanization that's hurting everyone. And so that whole Catholic social teaching starts to kick in later in the 19th century, spelling out a lot of these principles, as you know, especially with Rerum Novarum and with Leo the 13th, and I think that's 1891, the first real social encyclical that starts to spell out not just individual morality questions and ethical questions, but trying to think about things on a large scale. What are the principles that ought to be at work in a just and humane society? And starting with the sanctity of the human person, right? Infinitely valued and loved by God, whether we realize it or not, right? Whether we feel it or not, that's still the center of the reality of any society. But it's not just individuals who are. It's not the individual that's the primary kind of unit within a society. It's actually the family, because that's the most local communio. We talked earlier in the first session about what we're made in the image of God, who is communio. In our natural lives, our immediate family is that communio, right? That we are loved by others, we're moved to love and response, those at home, starting at home, right? Starting in marriage, starting with, and then flowing out from that, the children that might flow from marriage. That's the seminal kind of communio of what our human condition is. That's the most fundamental unit, the most essential unit within any society. And what was going on in the economy and the way the political things were developing on a very free market, capitalist, or later called a libertarian kind of approach. If you can make the money, and you do it, right? As long as you're not killing anybody doing it, right? So you have a radical private individualism that has very few checks on it, and then the response to it is the socialist response, saying no, we want equity, and it's the state that ought to take care of everything and manage everything. So you've got radical individualism, and then you've got a radical socialism, both of which are ending up doing dehumanizing things to people. So in one camp, you would say the individual person is the most important unit in society. The other side, you would say, no, the state is the most important unit. And actually the church comes in and says, no, it's actually the family in that communio of love, really. That every person in a family has dignity, and also every person within a family belongs to the other members of the family too, right? That there's a sense we have solidarity in the most intensive way in a family unit, right? And that's what it is to be human, is to know that I belong to others and that others belong to me, a sense of solidarity. You know, we're made all at the same time and with the same dignity, and we are just inextricably linked to each other, right? So there's solidarity that we need to keep practicing, and not just in the family, but you spread that out across the broader social sort of spectrum. We constantly need to be attentive to the needs. If we're really going to be human, or do our best at least, we need to constantly be attentive to those who are hurting, those who are marginalized, those who are forgotten, those who are oppressed. I do, and we do have an obligation, obviously, to be caring for them that's not just the government's responsibility. First and foremost, it's our responsibility, right? Starting with the local. And so that's the other principle, I think, that's so helpful, that creates a tension within Catholic social teaching, is that sense of solidarity and the habit of, I should always be troubled if there are people that are hurting. We, my family, maybe my neighborhood, maybe my parish, maybe my company, we ought to be troubled if other people are hurting and marginalized, right? And so it's our responsibility to reach out, to build relationships, to find what we can do to be of assistance, but not in a patronizing way, but because here's the other dimension, I think, of Catholic social teaching that's so essential. There's solidarity, we're in this together, but there's also a principle of subsidiarity at the very same time. If something, if there's a need in our world or in our society that can be taken care of at the most local level, then that's where it ought to be taken care of, because of that dignity of the human person, right? We shouldn't even do charity in such a way that further dehumanizes people. We don't just pour resources onto a poor person and say, okay, good luck, we stay away. If that's making them dependent and not respecting their genuine creativity and intelligence and desire to work and so on, there's a toxic charity. You probably talked about this before, maybe. So because of that principle of subsidiarity, we also want to always be thinking about how can, at the very most local level, the dignity of every person be restored, not just give them material things, right? But restore the dignity so that they can be creative and be agents of their own, and especially care for their own families and so on. So, but there's a tension there between solidarity and subsidiarity, right? In some areas of the, you got the whole political spectrum that leans a little bit more one direction or the other, but they all have to do with those principles that the church does lay out, and it's necessarily a tension there. There's individual dignity. There should be individual freedom because of that dignity, and we ought to push decisions and agency as much as possible to that most local level. And so that maybe leans a little bit in a distorted version of that would be a kind of a libertarianism, right? Everybody's on their own. That's a distortion of it. But then the other side of it is, no, we really want to care for the poor and the vulnerable. And so we ought to have big programs to make sure that everything runs right. And there's a leaning toward maybe the more socialist dimension of things. And going in either of those extremes, or settling into comfortably into either of those extremes, is when maybe things start to go south. And I think that's the big challenge. I take it, at least, as a big challenge within a Christian and Catholic approach to these things. There's a lot more nuance to who the human person is, what real justice looks like, that is not comfortably settled into by one secular ideology of one or the other, of a kind of a libertarianism or a socialism. There's a lot more nuance to it. There's much more dignity to the human person in our approach to things. And even continuing to explore or keep before us, as I said in that first session, this is who we are. We are infinitely loved, and we're also infinitely distorted by the traps that we get ourselves into. So it takes a lot for myself to get on that path of wholeness and dignity and so on, right? And if we multiply that out to how to live in a society that grapples with the dignity of what it is to be human, it's that much more challenging. But when we do come up against systemic sin or systemic injustices, those structures, laws, especially laws, I suppose, that are demeaning to others, they ought to be confronted. But that's not the end of it either, right? We can keep trying to adjust and make new laws, get different politicians in office, but none of those are going to be our salvation either, right? There's always going to be a lot of work to be done after an election too, right? That's the more important thing. All the attention goes on to elections themselves, and we keep thinking this party or that party or candidate's going to be that's just never, I think we get kind of a distorted projection of hope onto different candidates and parties personally. The real work has to be done on a day-to-day basis, where we are constantly in a habit of being attentive to other people, being attentive to groups of people who are hurting or marginalized. And if there's structures that need to be changed, we can change a law, but we still need to have a lot of work to be done to continue to bring everybody into that human family that we're called to be a part of. So I don't know if that is helpful at all, but it is kind of nice to think about it's helpful and also challenging, I think, to think about these different poles. There's the social and systemic dimension of things, but there's no quick fix on those, just like there's no quick fix on the personal level either. It's a long, ongoing, everlasting, maybe even challenge that we are drawn into, that we just continue to try to draw upon that grace that has been given to us, and to live out of that grace for one another. And we do what we can together to try to build up that civilization of love and of communion, knowing that we're also never going to get there either. But that's part of the big call for all of us as faithfuls.
Then the still small voice of God came loud and clear. Get out of bed, get on the ball, forget your fear.